The combine seized at 2:14 in the morning. Not slowly, not with warning. It seized, a sound like God crumpling a tin roof, and then the field went silent except for the Iowa wind pushing flat against a man's ears and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog that couldn't sleep either. Dale Murchison didn't curse, he didn't kick the machine. He pulled a flashlight from his bib pocket, clicked it on, and walked around the front of his 1961 Oliver Model 88 like a doctor circling a patient he already knew how to save. It was October 14th, 1974. He had 340 acres of popcorn still standing in the field. The first frost was 36 hours away, and every custom harvester within 100 miles had already told him no. Every single one. Let me tell you about Ringgold County, Iowa in the autumn of 1974. If you've never been to southern Iowa in October, understand this. The sky turns a color that painters have tried to name and failed. It's not gold, it's not amber, it's the color of something being completed, a long exhale that the land takes before it goes quiet for 6 months. The soil in Ringgold County is Class B loam. It holds moisture the way a sponge holds water too well sometimes after a wet September. The fields get soft in the low spots, and the machine ruts from a combine can run 6 inches deep by the third pass. Regular corn harvesters knew this. Custom operators with their brand new John Deere 6600s, $28,000 machines in 1974 dollars, chrome and green paint still factory bright, they knew it too. Which is why they steered clear of the small specialty plots. Too much risk for the acreage. Too many variables for machines calibrated to handle standard field corn at 15% moisture. Popcorn was different. Popcorn has a hull. It has a pericarp, a hard outer shell that requires different cylinder speeds, different concave clearances, different ground speeds, or the kernels crack and you lose the pop rate entirely. A cracked kernel won't pop, it just burns. And a farmer whose popcorn doesn't pop gets paid commodity corn prices instead of specialty prices. The difference in 1974 was about $1.10 per bushel versus $3.40 per bushel. That gap, $2.30 per bushel, is what this whole story lives and dies on. Mount Ayr, Iowa, population 1,820, the county seat of Ringgold County. A town with a grain elevator on one end of Main Street and the First National Bank of Mount Ayr on the other end, and everything a small farming community needs in between, a hardware store, a diner called Elna's that smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee every morning from 6 until 11. And a community of farmers who had been growing the same things in the same ways for 3 generations. Dale Murchison lived 9 miles south of town on a farmstead his grandfather had broken from prairie in 1911. The white farmhouse needed paint. The machine shed was a Quonset hut his father had erected in 1948 from Army surplus steel. The land was 480 acres, but only 340 were tillable. The rest was timber draws and a creek bottom that flooded 2 years out of 5. This is where our story begins, in the dark, in a broken-down field, with a man and a flashlight and 36 hours until frost. Dale Murchison was 44 years old in 1974. He was not a remarkable-looking man, 5'10", hands like a catcher's mitt, a face that had been weathered by 30-some Iowa winters into something that looked older than it was but steadier than most. He had graduated from Ringgold County High School in 1948. The same year his father put up that Quonset hut, and spent 2 years at Iowa State studying agriculture before the money ran out and he came home to help his father through a dry year that nearly broke them. He never went back. He married a schoolteacher named Pauline Graber in 1953. They had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. By 1974, the oldest boy, Terry, was helping on the farm. The younger 2 were still in school. What set Dale Murchison apart, what the county extension agent, a man named Harold Foss, would later describe as the most stubborn commitment to precision I ever saw in a farmer, was his attention to specifics. While his neighbors grew DeKalb and Pioneer hybrid field corn and sold it into the same elevator system that everyone else sold into, Dale had been quietly, methodically, converting his operation since 1968. It started with a conversation at the Iowa State Fair. A seed representative from a small company called Wyandotte Popcorn, based out of Marion, Ohio, was sitting at a booth that most farmers walked past without stopping. Dale stopped. He asked questions for 40 minutes. He came home with a 3-page typed fact sheet and a sample packet of yellow mushroom popcorn seed, and he spent that entire winter reading everything he could find about specialty grain production. By 1970, he had 80 acres in popcorn. By 1973, he had 240. By 1974, all 340 tillable acres were in specialty crops, 240 in popcorn, 80 in white food-grade corn for a tortilla chip manufacturer in Omaha, and 20 in ornamental Indian corn he sold to a craft supply company in Des Moines. His neighbors thought he was eccentric. His banker, a man we'll get to in a moment, thought he was reckless. His wife Pauline thought he was possibly right, but she said it quietly and mostly to herself. Dale drove a 1966 Chevy C10 pickup with 147,000 miles on it. He bought his work clothes from the Sears catalog. He had not taken a vacation since 1961. But Dale Murchison knew something. He knew it the way a man knows the back fields of his own land in the dark, by feel, by memory, by the particular way the ground changes under your feet when you know what to pay attention to. And on the night of October 14, 1974, standing next to a seized Oliver 88 in a black Iowa field, he was about to prove it. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room, or a bank office, or a grain elevator, where someone looked at you and made a decision about you before you said a single word, where the tilt of their chin told you everything about how they saw themselves in relation to you? Gary Stanhope had that chin. Gary Stanhope was 38 in 1974. He was the loan officer and, as of that January, the newly promoted vice president of the First National Bank of Mount Ayr. His father had been a grain merchant. His uncle was on the county board of supervisors. He wore pressed khakis in a town where everyone else wore denim, and he drove a 1973 Buick LeSabre that he washed himself every Saturday morning in his driveway, which everyone in town had noted because nobody in Mount Ayr washed their own car on Saturday morning. That was the kind of man Gary Stanhope was. He had approved Dale's first popcorn expansion loan in 1970, reluctantly, with conditions, and with what Pauline Murchison would later describe to her sister as that smile he has where only his mouth moves. By 1974, Dale owed First National $47,000. The farmstead was collateral. The loan had been refinanced twice. Gary Stanhope had made it clear in the careful language of bankers that he considered specialty crop production to be an aggressive and unproven strategy for an operation of this size and capitalization. What Gary actually thought, what he said at the Ringgold County Farm Bureau dinner in March of 1974, to a table that included Harold Foss and two other farmers and a John Deere dealership owner named Ron Presley, was that Dale Murchison was playing farmer instead of farming. The table had laughed, not cruelly exactly, but the way men laugh when they believe something is true and they're relieved someone else said it first. Ron Presley owned Presley Equipment on Highway 2, the largest John Deere dealership in the three-county area. He had 4 brand-new JD 6600 combines on his lot in September of 1974, and a custom harvesting crew of 6 that he ran as a side operation, hearing out to area farmers during harvest season. His crew could do 80 acres a day in good field corn. They wore matching green shirts with their names embroidered on the chest pocket. They drove a convoy of green and yellow equipment that you could see from a mile away. Ron Presley had turned Dale Murchison down for custom harvesting in September of 1974. "Popcorn's too fussy," he'd said. "Crack the kernels, you've ruined the whole load, not worth the liability." He'd said it in front of 2 other farmers at the elevator. Dale had nodded, thanked him, and driven away in his C10. Ron had watched him go and said to no one in particular, "Fella's gonna lose his shirt." The week before harvest, the first week of October 1974, Dale Murchison made a round of calls that took him 2 full days. He called 7 custom harvesters. He called the Iowa State Extension Office in Osceola. He called 2 equipment dealers in Creston. He drove to a farm near Kellerton where a man named Bud Yetter had once told him he'd harvested popcorn in Indiana before moving to Iowa. Bud Yetter's equipment had broken down in August and he hadn't fixed it yet. Every door came back closed. The reasons varied: equipment not calibrated for popcorn, schedules already full with field corn, the soft low ground in Ringgold County after the wet September, liability concerns, or simply the honest admission that they didn't know the crop well enough to risk it. Dale sat at the kitchen table with Pauline on the evening of October 7th. A Sunday, the dishes already done, the radio playing KCOB out of Newton, and he wrote down every number he knew. 340 acres of specialty crops. Frost probability rising daily after October 18th. Field corn price, $3.10 per bushel at the elevator. Popcorn contract price, $3.42 per bushel with Wyandotte, plus a quality premium of up to 40 cents per bushel for pop rate above 96%. White food corn contract, $3.85 per bushel with the Omaha processor, with a zero-tolerance clause for foreign grain contamination. If frost hit and the crop went down, or if the popcorn cracked and lost its pop rate, or if the white corn got contaminated, in any of those cases he would receive commodity prices for the whole lot. The difference between his contract prices and commodity prices across 340 acres was approximately $34,000 in gross revenue. Against a $47,000 loan, with the farmstead as collateral. Pauline looked at the numbers. She was a school teacher. She was precise. She said, "So you have to figure it out yourself." Dale said, "I know." Now here is where Gary Stanhope enters the story directly. On October 9th, 2 days after that kitchen table conversation, Dale drove into Mount Ayr to talk to Harold Foss at the extension office. He parked on Main Street. He was walking toward the extension office when Gary Stanhope stepped out of the bank. It was 10 in the morning, and their paths crossed on the sidewalk. The conversation that followed was witnessed by at least 4 people, including Elna Harms, who owned the diner and was sweeping her front step at the time. Gary said, "Dale, I hear you can't find anyone to take your popcorn." Dale said, "Working on it." Gary said, and this is the part Elna Harms would remember word for word 30 years later, "You know, I've been patient with your experiment out there, but I want you to understand something. If that crop doesn't come in clean this fall, we're going to have a very difficult conversation in January. Very difficult." Dale looked at him for a moment. He said, "I understand that, Gary." Gary straightened his tie. He said, "I'm just not sure you do. Ron Presley says that ground of yours is too soft for his equipment right now anyway. Maybe it's time to think about what a transition back to field corn looks like." He said transition back to field corn the way you might say it's time to consider assisted living. Gently, conclusively, as if the decision were already made and he was just being kind enough to announce it softly. Dale thanked him for his concern. He walked to the extension office. Harold Foss would later say that Dale came in that morning, sat down across the desk, and said, "Harold, I need to borrow your transactions of the ASAE volumes from 1966 through 1969. I need everything you have on cylinder speed and concave clearance for small kernel corn." Harold said, "Dale, what are you planning?" Dale said, "I'm going to harvest it myself." Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When was the last time you were told by someone with authority that something was impossible? And did you walk away, or did you go find the manual? Harold Foss pulled every relevant volume. He also made a phone call to a colleague at Iowa State who specialized in grain processing research. He gave Dale a carbon copy of a 1968 paper by Dr. Gerald Lemke on popcorn harvest losses related to mechanical thrashing parameters. Dale read it that night at the kitchen table while Pauline graded spelling tests. The paper was 24 pages long. Dale read it twice. Here is what Dale Murchison knew that Ron Presley and Gary Stanhope did not. He knew his Oliver 88. Not in the general way that a farmer knows his equipment, can start it, can operate it, knows roughly where the trouble spots are. Dale knew that machine the way a surgeon knows an instrument he's been using for 15 years. He knew its tolerances. He knew its personality. The Oliver Model 88 was not a new machine in 1974. It had been manufactured between 1947 and 1954. His had rolled off the Charles City, Iowa assembly line in 1952, and by 1974 it was the kind of equipment that a John Deere dealer would have quietly suggested retiring. Not because it was broken, but because newer was better. Because $28,000 John Deere 6600s with pressurized cabs and H-row headers were the future, and old Olivers were the past. But the Oliver 88 had something the big modern combines did not: adjustability. The cylinder-to-concave clearance on the Oliver 88 could be set manually by feel and wrench, to tolerances that the newer, faster, higher-capacity machines had essentially automated away. The automation on a JD 6600 was designed for speed and throughput on standard corn. It was not designed for the particular, fussy needs of a small kernel grain with a delicate hull. Dale had spent portions of 3 winters modifying his Oliver 88 specifically for popcorn. He had replaced the standard rasp bars with a set of rod-in-bat thrashing elements he had sourced from a small Iowa manufacturer called Hume Brothers Equipment in Ames, a modification recommended in a 1967 article in Prairie Farmer magazine that he had clipped and kept in a folder in the machine shed. He had fabricated custom wear plates for the concave from 3 16-inch cold-rolled steel, welded by his son Terry using a Lincoln Electric buzz box they kept in the back of the Quonset. The cylinder speed standard on the Oliver 88 at 1,000 RPM for field corn, he ran at 600 RPM for popcorn. 600, just barely turning, gentle as a suggestion. Ground speed 1.8 miles per hour, less than a fast walk. At that speed on soft ground, in the dark if necessary, one man with one machine could harvest approximately 4 acres per hour under ideal conditions. He had 340 acres. He had 36 hours until frost probability crossed 70%. He needed 85 hours of harvest time. He had 36 hours of weather window. But here was the other thing Dale knew. The weather window wasn't the whole calculation. Frost probability at 70% didn't mean certain frost. It meant a weighted average across the forecast region. Southern Ringgold County, sitting in a slight topographic bowl, ran 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding area on still nights. He had measured this himself with a thermometer on a fence post over 11 autumns. He estimated his actual window at closer to 52 hours if the wind stayed south. He needed 85 hours of machine time. He had a son who was 21 years old and could run the combine. He could run the grain wagon and the auger and the dryer. They could sleep in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. They could do it. Maybe. Pauline packed a cardboard box with food: a ham, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a dozen hard-boiled eggs, a thermos of coffee, and a second thermos she would refill every few hours and bring to the field herself. She did not argue. She did not suggest alternatives. She put on her coat and drove to the field with them when they started the machine at 4:30 in the afternoon on October 10th. She stood there in the headlights of the C-10 as the Oliver coughed to life, and she watched her husband drive into the standing popcorn, and she did not go home until she could no longer see the combine's light moving through the rows. Let me pause here and ask you, do you know someone in your life who has that kind of knowledge? Not the flashy kind, not the credentialed kind, but the deep, quiet, earned kind, the kind that only comes from years of paying attention when everyone else went home. Hold that person in your mind right now. Day 1, October 10th and 11th, 1974. Dale started in the driest field, the East 80. A gently sloping piece that drained well and had been planted to yellow mushroom popcorn, his most valuable variety at $3.82 per bushel contract. He drove the combine at 1.8 miles per hour, the cylinder turning at 600 RPM, the golden rows disappearing into the header like thread into a spool. Terry ran the grain wagon, a 1958 New Idea 200-bushel model with a hydraulic unload, pulled by an old Farmall M that burned oil but ran. Every load went to the grain bin on the farmstead, through a 6-inch auger into a propane-fired grain dryer they had rented from a neighbor named Cleo Swartz for $12 a day. The sound of the Oliver 88 at night is not what you would expect. At 600 RPM, the cylinder has a low, rhythmic sound, not the roar of a modern combine at full clip, but something more like a steady conversation between the machine and the grain. A thump and whisper, thump and whisper. Dale sat in the open cab, no enclosure, just a steel seat and a vibration you felt in your spine, and he listened to that sound the entire time, because any change in the rhythm told him something. A slight rise in pitch meant a slug coming through. He'd ease back on the ground speed. A rattle in the straw walkers meant moisture. He knew the machine the way a conductor knows an orchestra. By 4 a.m. on October 11th, they had 82 acres in the bin. Moisture content was running 18.2%, higher than ideal for storage but within dryer capacity. The temperature had held at 41 degrees F, no frost. Dale slept 2 hours in the cab of the C-10. Terry slept in the grain wagon. Pauline brought breakfast at 6 a.m., hard-boiled eggs and coffee, and the information that the radio forecast had pushed the frost window back slightly. A Canadian high-pressure system was moving slower than predicted. They had time. They kept going. Day 2, October 11th and 12th. The soft ground was the problem. The west field, the white food corn, 80 acres, sat in a natural drainage area, and the soil had taken on the consistency of stiff pudding. The C-10 got stuck twice on the approach road. Terry laid down a set of cedar fence posts as corduroy across the worst crossing, and they drove over them. The combine itself, running on steel lug extensions Dale had bolted to the rear drive tires in 1971 specifically for soft ground conditions, managed to float across without sinking. The lug extensions were not a manufacturer option. Dale had fabricated them himself from 2-inch angle iron. White food corn required something else from the Oliver 88, absolute cleanliness. The zero-tolerance contamination clause in his Omaha contract meant that even a single kernel of field corn, a single weed seed, a single bit of foreign grain in the load, and the entire delivery would be downgraded. Dale had run the combine's cleaning system, the chaffer, the sieve, the fan, at full capacity the night before harvesting the white corn. He had blown it out with compressed air from the Quonsit's tank. He had inspected the grain tank himself with a flashlight, checking every corner and seam. The white corn went in clean. The grain dryer ran around the clock. The propane bill would come to $340 for the 2-week period. Dale had budgeted $250. He did not stop the dryer. Day 3, October 12th and 13th. The ornamental corn, 20 acres of Indian corn in mixed colors, grown for a Des Moines craft company called Prairie Harvest Designs under a hand-typed contract that paid 23 cents per ear for perfect, unblemished ears, required hand harvesting. The Oliver 88 couldn't do it. This was the piece Dale had not fully solved before the season began. He solved it now. He drove into Mount Ayr at 7 a.m. on October 12th and knocked on 4 doors. He asked if anyone wanted to earn $3.25 an hour picking corn by hand, start immediately. He got 3 takers, a 17-year-old named Jeff Briggs whose family farmed north of town, a retired elevator worker named Vince Delaney who was 61, and said he hadn't done fieldwork in years but reckoned he still could, and Pauline's youngest sister, Doris Graber, who was 26 and between jobs. They worked from 8 a.m. to dark both days. Dale paid them in cash from an envelope Pauline kept in the kitchen drawer. The 20 acres of Indian corn came off the field in 2 days, 14,200 ears, hand-selected, packed in burlap bags, stacked in the Quonset to cure. Prairie Harvest Designs would later grade them at 93.4% perfect, well above the contract minimum of 85%. The 51-hour mark arrived at 7:30 p.m. on October 13th. Dale was in the field on the combine, on the last 40 acres of yellow mushroom popcorn, the machine's headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the standing rows. The temperature was 38 degrees F. The wind had died, the stars were out. His hands had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 30 and taken on a numb, distant quality that he recognized from the one other time he'd pushed himself this far, a March blizzard in 1965 when he'd spent 2 days digging cattle out of drifts. Terry drove the grain wagon alongside in the dark, matching the combine's crawl. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say. The work was what it was, and it was almost done. The combine cylinder thumped and whispered, thumped and whispered. At 11:47 p.m. on October 13th, Dale Murchison made the last pass on the last field. He shut the Oliver 88 down in the field lane. The engine ticked and cooled. He climbed down from the seat, his knees aching, and he walked to the edge of the harvested ground and stood looking at the stubble in the moonlight. 340 acres, done. The frost came at 3 a.m. Think about this, 51 hours. For most of us, 51 hours is 2 work days and some change. For Dale Murchison, it was the entire equation. It was the distance between keeping the farm and losing it. What would you be willing to endure for something that was entirely yours? He called the Iowa State Extension the following week and asked Harold Foss to help him get the load samples tested. Pop rate on the yellow mushroom, 97.3%. Quality premium, 40 cents per bushel. The white food corn graded at 0 contamination. The Indian corn came in at 93.4% perfect. Final gross revenue from the 1974 specialty harvest, $118,420. Loan balance at First National Bank of Mount Ayr, $47,000. Word gets around in a county of 5,400 people. It doesn't travel fast on purpose. It travels the way smoke moves through a building, under doors and through gaps, until suddenly everyone has smelled it and nobody can say exactly when it arrived. By the third week of October, people in Mount Ayr knew that Dale Murchison had harvested all 340 acres himself. By the first week of November, people knew the quality numbers. By December, when Dale walked into the First National Bank of Mount Ayr and placed a check on Gary Stanhope's desk for $47,000, the entire remaining loan balance, paid in full, the story had already reached the elevator, the co-op, the Farm Bureau, and Elna's diner. Gary Stanhope looked at the check for a long moment, then he looked up at Dale. Dale said, "I think that clears us up." Gary said, "It does." He didn't say anything else. He didn't smile, not even the smile where only his mouth moves. He picked up the check, turned it over to confirm the bank routing number on the back, and set it down again. Elna Harms, who heard this story from Pauline Murchison and repeated it many times at her diner counter, would always conclude it the same way. Gary Stanhope didn't shake his hand. He should have shaken his hand. But he didn't, and that says everything you need to know about both men. Ron Presley heard the numbers at the co-op meeting in November. He'd been explaining to the group why he'd turned Murchison down, liability, soft ground, machine calibration, when someone mentioned the pop rate figure. 97.3%, the quality premium, the final revenue number. Ron was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Huh. That was all." There is something particular about the silence that falls on people who confidently predicted failure when they are forced to confront success. It isn't shame exactly. It isn't quite respect. It's something in between, a recalculation happening in real time, a revision of the categories they'd assigned to things. The category that had read Dale Murchison, eccentric, reckless playing farmer, was being quietly, uncomfortably rewritten. Dale Murchison did not attend the co-op meeting where Ron Presley said, "Huh." He was home. He was sleeping. He had been sleeping very soundly since October 14th. By 1977, Dale Murchison's operation had become something of an anomaly in Ringgold County, not famous exactly, but known. The kind of known that comes from steady results over time rather than a single dramatic moment. He had expanded to 520 tillable acres after purchasing the neighbor's ground in 1975, the Hollenbeck Place, 140 acres of good loam that had been farmed to field corn for 40 years and was tired of it. He paid $480 per acre, which people at the elevator called aggressive. 3 years later, comparable ground in Ringgold County was selling for $900 per acre. He had also begun doing something that would define the second half of his farming life. He started teaching. Harold Foss at the Extension office began referring specialty grain growers to Dale for informal consultation. It started with a phone call in the spring of 1976 from a young farmer in Clark County named Pete Schultz who had 60 acres of popcorn and no idea how to calibrate his combine. Dale drove to Clark County, spent half a day with Pete, and charged him nothing. Pete Schultz would farm popcorn successfully for the next 28 years and would, in 1991, give the keynote address at the Iowa Specialty Grain Conference, at which he mentioned Dale Murchison by name. By 1979, the Murchison operation had a written protocol, Dale's own words, typed on a Royal typewriter by Pauline, for specialty grain harvest on soft-ground farms in southern Iowa. Harold Foss incorporated sections of it into Extension publications. It was never copyrighted. Dale didn't think of it that way. Terry Murchison, the oldest son, took over day-to-day operation of the farm in 1983, when Dale turned 53 and his knees, which had been complaining since 1974, began to insist on more selective use. Terry had grown up in those 51 hours, had learned something in that long dark field that no classroom could have taught. He ran the operation with the same precision his father had established, and expanded it to 780 acres by 1989. Dale lived on the farmstead until 1998. He died in January of 2001 at 71, from a heart condition he'd known about since 1995 and managed with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else. He died in the farmhouse his grandfather had built, in the county where he had been born, with clear title to land that had once nearly been taken from him. Pauline outlived him by 11 years. She continued teaching until 1981. She's remembered in Mount Air for the spelling tests she gave on Friday afternoons and for a particular tiredness she had after the harvest of 1974, a tiredness she never fully explained to anyone because the people who needed to understand it had been there, and the people who hadn't been there wouldn't have understood. What happened to the other men in this story? Gary Stanhope was promoted to bank president in 1981. He retired in 1993. The First National Bank of Mount Air merged with a regional bank holding company in 1997, and the local branch eventually closed in 2008. The building on Main Street is now a real estate office. Ron Presley's John Deere dealership expanded through the 1970s and early 1980s. In 1986, during the farm crisis, his financing arm caught a large number of defaulting farm loans and he was forced to restructure. He sold Presley equipment in 1988. He had by that point added a small custom harvesting service for specialty crops to his operation: popcorn, birdseed, sunflowers, white food corn. He had apparently figured out the calibration. The Oliver Model 88, Dale's 88, the one that seized at 2:14 in the morning on October 14, 1974, was retired from field use in 1981 after 29 years of service. Terry had it restored in 1994 and it sat in the machine shed for years, polished and still. In 2003, Terry donated it to the Ringgold County Historical Society, where it is on display to this day. There is a small card next to it, handwritten, that says, "Harvested 340 acres of specialty grain in 51 hours, October 1974. Dale Murchison, operator." No additional explanation, it doesn't need one. I want to ask you one more thing before we close. When you think about the machines in your life, the tools, the methods, the systems that others have told you to replace, to upgrade, to let go of, are you certain they're telling you the truth, or are they telling you what's true for them? The niche market Dale Murchison found in 1968, specialty grain production on small, irregular, wet-ground farms in southern Iowa, was a market that existed because everyone else had looked at it and decided the margins weren't worth the complications. The big operators wanted big, clean, open fields. They wanted straight acres and simple logistics and machines running at full capacity. They left the complicated acres for someone willing to learn the complications. That is historically how niche markets work. They don't appear out of nowhere. They appear when the people who could serve them decide not to, and they belong entirely to the person stubborn enough to show up. Let me tell you what I think this story is really about. It isn't about popcorn. It isn't about combined calibration or pop rate percentages or the price difference between specialty grain contracts and commodity markets. It's about a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't have a certificate, the kind that accumulates in a person who refuses to stop paying attention. Dale Murchison didn't have a graduate degree in agricultural engineering. He had a 1968 article from Prairie Farmer, a 1967 modification guide from Hume Brothers Equipment, a 1968 paper from Dr. Lem, and 11 autumns of thermometer readings on a fence post. He had patience when impatience was cheaper and easier. He had specificity when generality was the accepted mode. And he had the quiet confidence, not arrogance, not bravado, of a man who knows what he knows. Not because someone told him, because he learned it one October at a time, out in a field where nobody was watching and nobody was applauding, and the only audience was the crop itself, which has no patience for pretense. The world has always had Gary Stanhopes, people with pressed khakis and the chin tilt of judgment, who mistake the size of a machine for the depth of a mind, who look at a man driving a 1952 Oliver and see a man behind the times rather than a man ahead of everyone else. And the world has always had Dale Murchisons, quiet people, precise people, people who read the 24-page paper twice, people who build wear plates from 3/16-inch cold-rolled steel and measure temperature on a fence post for 11 years and show up at the bank in December with a check that covers everything. They don't usually make the news, they don't usually give the keynote address, though sometimes their students do. They just farm, they just work, they just know. The lesson isn't work harder than everyone else. Dale wasn't trying to be the hardest worker in Ringgold County. He was trying to be the most knowledgeable person in the field he had chosen specifically because others had decided not to choose it. The lesson is this: the work that others consider beneath them or beyond them or not worth the trouble, that work is almost always available. And the person willing to learn it deeply and do it precisely will find that the market is not competitive, because everyone else already left. Patience and specificity, old wisdom and new application, knowing your machine, knowing your ground, knowing the frost window runs warmer in the bowl of the valley and that 52 hours is enough if you sleep in shifts and your wife fills the thermos. That is farming, that is, for that matter, most things worth doing. Dale Murchison never told this story himself. He was asked about it occasionally, and he would say something brief, "We got it done," or "the machine held up," and then he would change the subject to something he found more interesting, like the moisture characteristics of the 1979 white cap dent variety or the drainage tile system he'd put in on the Hollenbeck place. He found his own past less interesting than the problem in front of him. That too is something. Thank you for watching The Forgotten Farmer. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you know or of something in yourself, leave a comment below. We read every one of them. And if you know a story like Dale's, a quiet farmer, a stubborn machine, a market nobody else wanted, send it to us. These stories deserve to be told. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling. The Oliver Model 88 was manufactured in Charles City, Iowa from 1947 to 1954. Wyandotte Popcorn, based in Marion, Ohio, was a real specialty grain company operating in this era. Specialty popcorn contracts in the 1970s did offer significant premiums over commodity field corn prices. Iowa State Extension agricultural publications on specialty grain harvest were available to farmers in this period. The agricultural economic pressures of the 1970s described in this story, rising land values, increasing loan exposure, farm consolidation, reflect documented historical conditions in southern Iowa.